Hello again, Trekkies! We're still working through some of the topics you voted on over a year ago. And today we're going to have a look at the hearts of ships we love as we talk about engineering layouts on this edition of...
Yeah, it's the best five, worst five, no one has seen. Yeah, it's the best five, worst five Treks ever seen.
Considering how many movies and episodes of Trek we've had, there aren't a ton of looks at engineering sections outside of hero ships. We'll be considering every engineering section we've seen in Alpha Canon, including alien designs. Though this is still a Starfleet-heavy list. The criteria are pretty subjective here compared to most of these best and worst videos, and I imagine we're all going to have some varied bests and worsts. So let's dive in. Per the norm, starting at 5th worst. Crossfield. The engineering section of Discovery is an elusive thing. In Season 1, I didn't even question where engineering was. Cut to Season 2, and it's not till Jet Reno says to Stamets that she's ordered by the chief engineer to do something, and I actually realized that we hadn't named a chief engineer, and we may not have seen engineering. We don't see the warp core till it's being dumped and weaponized at the end of Season 3, that you realize that the core isn't something just in an accessible room. The room with the spore cube we see more often has been referred to as both engineering and the spore room, which complicates this entry significantly. And for not clarifying this stuff 5 seasons in, the Crossfield engineering finds itself here. Number 4. California. Though one of Lower Deck's oldest running gags is the love of sights and sounds of the finely tuned warp core, the engineering layout isn't the greatest. The warp core itself is big and impressive, but the room which it sits in feels sterile and spread out, and the metal floor plating with painted striping for some reason doesn't do anything for the aesthetic. The consoles are quite spread out, and there's some weird consoles like this thing that feel like they're just getting in the way. I guess it's fine for a ship class that isn't known for doing the important jobs in the fleet. At least Billups is probably the most nuanced chief engineer with varying talents since Scotty. Number 3. Constitution Original. I mean, for a 60s TV show on a limited budget, this is serviceable. If I'd seen it in its original run, I may have been more impressed compared to what was considered technology in other sci-fi of the time. However, versus what we've seen since, it's just a room that serves plot purposes, and I have very little to say otherwise. I mean, even Scotty spends more time in the big chair than in engineering. Number 2. Constellation. It's very seldom that we see what drives Starfleet vessels outside of hero ships, but in TNG's peak performance, the set designers did take the time to throw an engineering section together. And considering it's the most nacelles we'd seen on a ship up to this point, the core that powers them looks just one step above a coal-fired boiler. The room itself is cramped and there aren't many stations. Granted, we're seeing a ship that's been mothballed for years in terrible condition to begin with, but this is easily the worst designed engineering section we've seen on a Starfleet ship to date. After seeing it, there's no wonder why Picard once said the Stargazer was an underpowered vessel. And the worst engineering section in Trek at number 1, Xyrillians. Enterprise's Unexpected is definitely that. An unexpectedly bad plotline that presents us with a confounding engineering section, and the only one on this list not part of a Starfleet vessel. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to this setup. It's just a mass of lights and tubes. While Trip's trippin', this must be an interesting light show, but it doesn't seem practical in any way, and feels like what would happen if you let a toddler design a warp core. Looking at this, I'm honestly not sure how these folks made it into space, but I guess I buy this over the Bajorans' early attempts with basically no engineering section at all. As we prime the intermix chambers of the best engineering layouts, if you're enjoying the content, please consider a like and subscribe. At 5th best, Protostar. The section itself is merely serviceable in this small-scale ship, but 2 top-of-the-line warp cores and the experimental Protostar drive are impressive additions to its engineering section. It does seem kind of dark by Starfleet standards, and this is probably the fewest number of consoles we've seen. But on a ship designed to be crewed by a few dozen officers, this makes sense. A beautiful engineering section for a very sleek ship. And if anything goes wrong, I bet Jankum Pog will fix it. Number 4, Constitution Strange New Version. I feel like Strange New Worlds has created a nice mix of classic TOS engineering and the Kelvinverse massive pipes and nuclear storage tanks. I really buy it as an engineering section for the mid-23rd century time period this is set in. There are plenty of well-spread out stations, and while the warp core itself is a little different than we're used to, I dig how this retains the hexagonal hallway around it from the original series. It's anybody's guess at this point, with a new season a year or so out, whether the chief engineer will continue to be Pelia, or if this engineering section will have a tradition of a new chief engineer every season. And could it be Scotty sooner than later? Number 3, Constitution Refit. I never thought I'd say this, but the motion picture makes the top 5 for something. The Constitution class gets a 3rd entry in these rankings, with an engineering set that is really impressive, and feels distinctly like a bridge between what had come before and what we would get less than a decade later in TNG. You have the central vertical pulsing core, but still the big clumsy-looking piping feeding into it, and seems to be a natural progression from goes nowhere, does nothing pipes from the TOS days. Though it was pressed into service before it was properly put through its paces, it's probably the most well-built set piece from the motionless picture. Number 2, Galaxy. Since this is more about general setup than complete function, I will choose to ignore the biggest sin I gave the Galaxy class in my ship designs video. That being a warp core ejection system that failed literally every time it was needed. Maybe it's just nostalgia goggles for the show I grew up on, but once you look past the death trap part of the equation, there's something perfectly beautiful and iconic about this design. Just the right amount of consoles that are well spaced, and the piping from a century prior is gone from normal view, tucked out of the way to move about engineering freely. Its hum is probably one of the most soothing noises I've ever heard. A great-looking engineering section, even if the core itself has some flaws. And the best engineering layout in Trek get number 1, Intrepid. It's like it took everything that was great about the Galaxy class design and made it better. Consoles on nearly the entirety of available wall space, and a bigger, more accessible second level. The core is absolutely beautiful, watching the plasma surge through it with different wispy colors, and the time Q's son turned it into a nightclub light show was kinda great. They even seem to have fixed that pesky core ejection problem from the Galaxy class. It would have been really interesting if they'd actually shown the secondary warp core from Voyager schematics, but I guess when they left DS9, it was intended to be installed on Tuesday. I don't know that Trek can ever top this beautiful yet functional design, but I encourage them to try. What's your favorite engineering layout?